This is Rabbanit Sarna and Rabbi David Wolkenfeld. Shalom and welcome to The Straw Hat. We are the official podcast of Anshe Shalom B'nai Israel Congregation, an Orthodox synagogue in the beautiful Lakeview neighborhood of Chicago, Illinois. This week's episode, we have two segments and an interview. Segment number one is about the amazing scholar in residence we just had at our show, Rabbi Dr. Zev Eleff, and some of the ideas he raised about denominational titles, particularly within Orthodoxy, and particularly what is modern Orthodoxy. Then we'll transition into a segment about the domestic based on a conference that I just went to. And lastly, we have an interview with two Anshe Shalom alumni or members of the Anshe Shalom diaspora, Tali, Arbit, Winkler, and Jon Eskreis-Winkler, or I should say, Dr. Jon Eskreis-Winkler.
So 2 weeks ago, we had a really fascinating scholar in residence, Rabbi Dr. Zev Eleff, who I know is a long-time Ben Bayit in your home,
yes.
And a really treasured local colleague here in the Chicago area. He came to our shul and gave a series of really, I think, stimulating lectures, really compelling topics. I guess, of the things he spoke about, he Shabbat, early afternoon, right after Kiddush, he spoke about the history of the bat mitzvah within the American Orthodox community. And the really fascinating dynamic that he showed was that in the 60s and 70s, bat mitzvah celebrations were a really controversial topic of internal Orthodox polemic in New York City, but they had existed for like two generations, since the 1940s, in Midwestern Orthodox congregations here in Chicago and elsewhere. That's a really, really interesting dynamic, that things can be happening out here in the hinterland that people are not aware of in New York. And then, decades later, all of us, let's debate this and talk about this. So I was aware of that history, I think from the reading I had done, prior. But what's so great about the presentation is what he brought together some really great primary documents from various archives to sort of show that history as it unfolds. One neat thing I thought was kind of cool that he found the shul bulletin in which Alana Kagan's Chief Justice Alana Kagan's bat mitzvah was announced in the Lincoln Square Synagogue bulletin. She was the first bat mitzvah at Lincoln Square Synagogue, and which I think Rabbi Riskin has written about with great pride since he's become a Supreme Court justice. But that's a really neat thing to track down and find this really very understated way in which her parents were wished a mazel tov on the occasion of her bat mitzvah. I also found some really stimulating his remarks on Friday night after dinner. He spoke about the history of the term modern Orthodoxy. That's sort of one of his areas of expertise as a scholar. And he showed how amongst the modern Orthodox intelligentsia, the intellectual thought leaders of modern Orthodoxy, there was a real fraught relationship with the term itself, and it was rejected very strenuously at one point by, I think it's most of these people, and then they came to reconsider and accept it, and then maybe rejected it again. Rabbi Lamb, I think, went back and forth over a period of 40 years in terms of his thoughts about the term modern Orthodoxy itself. And so that was sort of interesting, again, to see the documents of how the term, really fraught meaning, and those who use it had a fraught relationship to it. So that
it's kind of amazing, because I think nowadays we would call someone a flip-flop. Like, you put it in writing 20 years ago, you must still stand by it, as opposed to when we look at historical figures, we're like, wow, it's so interesting, their development. And I think it gives you confidence to write a little bit, that you're history will judge you kindly for developing in your thinking over the time.
You're allowed to change your mind, even in writing, even if you're a prominent figure. That's true, and great people have done so. My sort of one takeaway for me, after hearing him speak about this history of the term unorthodox, is sort of the missing piece, or the next step of this kind of research would be to chart how the term is used, not by thought leaders and intellectuals and rabbis, but how it's used by Amcha, by the users, right, the practitioners, and particularly perhaps the least famous and prominent among them. And because I think modern Orthodoxy is in fact a term that has really very different uses and meanings from different people, right? So I think all of these people who are debating the term
by the way, I think orthodoxy also means different things to people who use it.
Oh, that's it. Do you want to?
Meaning, I think some people, just the fight over, that's an Orthodox shul, that's not an Orthodox shul, that's this. Or, I'm Orthodox, you're not Orthodox, I'm Orthodox. and I have a lot of deep skepticism about that whole conversation and like what the purpose of it is, because I think these terms are just so kind of fluid and flexible. And by the way, there's no mitzvah in the Torah to be orthodox. There's a mitzvah in the Torah to do a mitzvah and learn Torah and things like that. But like being like the obsession with this language of orthodoxy, modern Orthodox, centrist Orthodox, ultra Orthodox, left-leaning Orthodox, open Orthodox, like all of these words, it's sort of like, I think we just like, we spend too much time on it. Like spend more time improving yourself as a human and as a servant of God and as an observer of the Torah, and like, who cares?
Fair point. I think that's a different. I guess would you see that? I guess what I'm trying to get at is the same word being used in very different ways by different strata of our community,
right?
Which is a little bit different from this.
Is it? I'm asking like a more.
Yeah, so who cares anyway about terms? So let's granted that we're going to like talk about terms and people are going to use labels to help give clarity to their lives and explain themselves to others. I think modern Orthodoxy in particular is a term that is used in very different ways, maybe even opposite ways by different people. I think the thought leaders use modern Orthodoxy, let's say, some sort of grand synthesis between Torah and general studies, or an embrace of traditional observance of Torah and mitzvot, and also an embrace of broad general education and commitment to being a good neighbor and good citizen, something along those lines. In which case, modern Orthodoxy is really quite an elite movement. It's more demanding than other forms of Orthodoxy because there are twice as many things that you have to care about and really devote yourself to in a really significant way.
And the interest, like, I mean, in some ways I grew up in the cradle of modern Orthodoxy, right? Like at the Maimonides school, which is founded by Rav Soloveitchik and very much to this day kind of like guided by, I remember when I was a student at Maimonides, I wanted there to be a women's Megillah reading, and they said the Rav was opposed. And like that was the answer. I was like, but Rashi and this, like I brought like all of this learning. I sat with my community rabbi who did allow for women's Megillah readings, and he gave me like this huge source sheet printed like the way they used to print source sheets on these like massive pieces of paper, and I brought it to the Rosh Yeshiva of the school, and he was like, the Rav was opposed. Anyways, whatever. So very much like on the and as day schools went, it was organized interestingly. Like many day schools have Liudei Kodesh in the morning and like kind of regular high school studies in the afternoon or something like that. Maimonides, they were interspersed on purpose because they should all talk to each other. So you would go from Gemara Shir to calculus to American history, and that would be a normal day in the life. And the idea was that the ideas should all flow. Something you're learning about in Gemara Shir should influence the way you approach your calculus class, and vice versa.
So it's definitely that's not right. So that's a very elite kind of advanced form of religiosity. I think with this kind of, modern Orthodox Jews should watch the least amount of television of any type of Orthodox Jews, because we have, twice as many. Not only do you have to study Torah with diligence, you also, should be reading Holding in Shakespeare, right?
Exactly.
And Milton, right? So how do you, what time is there for time? And
sorry, just to round out what I was saying before, like one of the things that was always a conversation is like, what does it mean that we're modern Orthodox? You could say it's we go from Gemara Shir to calculus class, but other people would be like, we're modern Orthodox, so we don't have to like cover our knees or whatever, and people would always be like, that's not what it is.
Right,
like,
exactly.
That's not the point.
Exactly. So in contrast, I think amongst like the actual practitioners, people who call themselves, who self-identify, often they use it to mean a kind of, like what in Israel they call dati light, a kind of a more casual relationship to mitzvah. Like, I'm modern Orthodox, we do X, and we're modern Orthodox, for example, right? So and that's a very, very different use of the term, where it really stands. And there's maybe some, like, there's nothing modern about showing your knees, right? I mean, like people have been showing their knees for thousands of years, right? That's not modernity that leads to that. It's something else, right? So that's sort of interesting. That's what I'm kind of curious about. How do people who like self-identify, like embrace a label or use a label to like ascribe to themselves a label which signifies like a casual relationship to mitzvah? I think that's I think it's not a great way to be. I think that's not. I worry about the sustainability of like embracing and sort of self-identifying as being kind of casual. I feel like it's different from having like a lenient approach. You can say like based on my study and based on my values, like I'm adopting a lenient stance on, I don't know, like restrictions of kol isha, right? Based on like that can be informed by certain values, such as of feminism, of empowering women. It can be informed by scholarship and seeing how the term is used in the Talmud and how it's used in the Rishonim, and then you can come to a conclusion that can look different from how some other communities are practicing these restrictions. But that seems like a very, very different way of being in the world and sort of relating to Torah, relating to mitzvah, relating to one's own self and one's own relationship with God, as opposed to we're modern Orthodox, we don't care about that, we're just we're modern Orthodox, so we can just be casual about these things, which I think that's
right. And it could be the very same practice, right? Like you could say, we're modern Orthodox, so we listen to women sing. Kol Isha, I think, is a great example. Could be just like we live in the modern world and we're lenient about some things, and so we're lenient about this. Or you could say, I have learned the Sridei Eish on this, and I have read Rav Bigman's Tshuva, and I have all of the halachic literature produced basically since the Holocaust about this subject that provides us with leniencies in terms of women singing, or also Rav Ovadia has written very compellingly about Kol Isha as well, particularly like in the synagogue context. And based on my learning, I'm ready to take a more lenient approach. That's a completely different way of getting to maybe the same place.
Yeah, and the expectation is not that everyone's going to do that learning themselves, but that they're part of a community whose leadership, whose religious leadership, whose intellectual leadership, whose halachic leadership has done that learning and has thought about this, and that filters down to a community saying, we're quite meticulous in our observance, and we're adopting
and in
on this
my
issue.
Meticulous observance, yes. I listen to women saying in such and such environments.
Yeah. So I think that's. That'd be interesting to see sort of play out, like the scholarship of how the term is used, and then to think how we want to respond and how we want to encourage people to think about their own religious lives. I was at a study day recently, a small conference mostly for congregational rabbis, Orthodox congregational rabbis, devoted to some of the challenges. Current work being done to free agunot and respond to sort of very old, modern iteration of an old problem. And something that I had not quite realized was really brought home to me was that this is a problem where the modern Orthodox community is really leading the way and providing services that is mostly going to benefit people outside of our modern Orthodox community, right? It's our community for various reasons. Maybe it's the use of the prenup, maybe it's a certain set of values that have infused our community, and sort of is in terms of what types of behavior we tolerate and don't, whatever it may be, for whatever reason, our community seems not to be producing agunot, at anywhere close to the rate that was happening even 10 years ago.
I saw this morning, by the way, someone posted on Facebook, the latest issue of Mishpacha magazine is about the prenup.
Fascinating.
Isn't that fascinating?
Wow.
I want to get a copy now. I don't even know how I would go about doing that, but
I'll tell you, somebody I know who gets them.
Oh, okay, great. If you get Mishpacha magazine, I want to see it.
I think there is a listener, actually. I know a listener to the podcast who gets Mishpacha, who has access to it regularly. So
fabulous. Come find me.
So that's interesting. So I think I'm often aware of the ways in which the non-modern Orthodox community is providing us with a lot of our kashrut mashgichim and a lot of our...
Or just meaning Boston versus Chicago, for example. Boston has way fewer kosher restaurants because the Haredi population meaning I think the modern Orthodox population in Boston might actually be bigger, just judging by day school enrollment numbers or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But possibly, I don't even know. But the Haredi population in Chicago is much bigger and allows then for really wonderful kosher restaurants that we do not have in the state of Massachusetts.
Interesting. Yeah. That's supposed to be numbers here. I'm thinking, what services do we outsource to them? Right? They provide almost all shchita in anywhere in the world. Most, not all, but most safrut. Not right. A lot of these sort of religious functionaries and sort of the religious paraprofessionals, whatever you want to call it, right? This kind of they require advanced training and dedication to this religious craft. Most of that, I think, is coming from the Haredi community right now. And here's an example. Here's a counterexample here in terms of aguna activism, in terms of coming up with solutions, in terms of batei din that are responding in a more proactive way. I think that's coming from our community, but we're serving largely a clientele that's a little bit, one step removed, or more than one step removed from our community. So it's it's an interesting way in which, again, we should not think of ourselves as like Orthodox light. We should think of ourselves as like an elite of Orthodoxy, because we're embracing the same Torah and mitzvot, but we're also committed to like being good citizens and good neighbors, and also committed to synthesizing the best that's being produced and thought and developed by other human beings who aren't Jewish, and et cetera, et cetera.
I had the opportunity recently to look at the Rambam's Hilchot Sanhedrin. Someone asked me a question, and it brought me there, whatever. Okay. And one of the things he says is like, who's eligible to sit on the Sanhedrin? The people should be both extraordinarily learned, but also they should probably be like doctors or astronomers or scientists or philosophers. Like they need to be experts also in something else, says the Rambam, who of course himself was an expert in probably just about everything available to him at his time. Being
he didn't have to go to medical school, though. I just want to put that out.
It's true. It was easier, right? But still, right? Like he felt that. So in the Rambam's eyes, who should be sitting on the Sanhedrin someday? Modern Orthodox rabbis.
Indeed. Cool.
Which is, by the way, might account for why so many modern Orthodox day schools are called Maimonides.
Yes. That's another really interesting. Like I'm sure this has been, the history of. I think this has been done. I think I even read the article, but like the Maimonides as a sort of
model.
That's like a heroic figure for modern Jews is a really interesting
And then
story.
You read his writing about how women can only go out of the house a few times a month and should wear a hijab and how you can beat them. And then you're sort of like, people are still complicated.
Yes, of course.
So we were just talking about a conference that Rabbi Wolkenfeld was at. I, too, just had an amazing learning opportunity of a quite different variety. The Katz Center for Advanced Jewish Studies in Philadelphia brings in a group of 10 kind of synagogue clergy every year to learn from the scholars who they've gathered there. And every year they gather scholars to work on a particular subject in Jewish studies. So this year they're talking about the Jewish home and the domestic. And I had the opportunity, I'll go 3 times over the course of the year to go learn with a variety of different scholars.
So just to be clarified, when you say scholar, you mean like academics. Professors or grad students, postdocs?
Not grad students, professors, basically. And maybe a postdoc or 2. I don't know. The people we all learned from were faculty in various places. One was faculty at Berkeley, another was faculty at Stony Brook. It's there's some letters before that.
SUNY Stony Brook.
Yeah, SUNY Stony Brook. And another was at the University of Virginia. We were assigned reading in advance because it has to feel like a real seminar. So we read a book by Professor Vanessa Oakes called Inventing Jewish Ritual, which honestly... as like an Orthodox person reading the book, I struggled with it a little bit.
We invent rituals too.
Right, but I felt like she actually didn't give enough like credence to Orthodox people who invent rituals, which made me like go down this whole rabbit hole of like, I think Orthodox Jews in some ways invent like the best rituals.
Like what? What's it?
Like just because they're so informed and educated, and then just trying to like bring specific meaning into their home. Someone sitting around the table, a reform rabbi sitting around the table said, "Isn't parenting just the activity of inventing rituals?" Which I thought was like a great insight, actually. And then I think Orthodox parents invent like Orthodox parenting rituals,
like the Shabbos party.
Right, the Shabbos party, or like the Havdalah dance, or whatever it is, right? It's like taking these like, or like, we do it at our shul, right? Like at Havdalah, we have like a set list of songs that we sing, and we every week give out glow sticks, and right, like nowhere in halacha does it say like give out glow sticks but like these like para halachic kind of rituals. I mean, we were just talking in the last segment about the development of bat mitzvah, which again is like taking this like very deeply kind of Torah idea that people go from a state of not being obligated in mitzvot to a state of being obligated in mitzvot, and that this is a moment that should be marked. Obviously, bar mitzvah is not in the Torah either, but has like developed as a Jewish ritual, and that the same thing should be developed for women. And so we invent these like deeply learned rituals that are steeped in kind of Torah and Jewish history and knowledge. And I felt like the book doesn't give enough credit to that, because I feel like I see it every day, and every like Orthodox community home I go into has their own kind of like, how do you like, what does your Shabbos table look like? What happens at it? But that also like one of the themes we talked about a lot was the relation, because almost everyone around the table is a synagogue professional, except for obviously the professor who was giving the talk. We talked about, like, when you're talking about the domestic, what's actually the relationship between the domestic and the synagogue, which is really interesting, especially nowadays, because so much, like, Jewish communal money is going towards these, like, home-based, like we have in our own community, like Beis Hillel, with Rabbi Megan and Paige, and there's a lot of, like, energy towards these, like, home-based things. And then what does that say about the synagogue? And some of the non-Orthodox rabbis felt, like, very anxious about it in the sense of, like, if we empower other people to lead their own rituals, then what are they going to come to us for?
That's wild.
Isn't that intense?
Yeah.
But I think we feel the opposite. We're like, do more rituals at home.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like Learn and Earn is about doing more rituals at home and in your private life. I send home every week in the family email Parsha themes for the specific purpose of discussion around your home Shabbos table. And we kind of feel like the more we can, or like our community kashrut standards is another great example of that. Like, obviously our synagogue is kosher, but, like, that's not enough. Like, we want the members of our community to have kosher homes as well, so that they can, you know, the domestic lives of our membership can flow one into the other seamlessly.
I would say whenever I have the opportunity to have, like, professional conversations with with non-Orthodox rabbis, people who serve non-Orthodox congregation, I always, I'm really impressed by the professionalism and their commitment and their devotion to their communities. And I'm also so grateful that I work at an Orthodox shul and they don't have to, like, the challenges they face seem so, thank God, remote from, like, obviously there's a lot of similarity, and people are people, and, you know, and people are born and they die and they get married and they, you know, et cetera. You know, that's all there. But, they have the unique challenges they face, and thank God the unique, like, opportunities we have in the Orthodox community is really it's quite different. But I just want to, like, just take a step back, like, this fellowship bringing together like practitioners with the scholars who are, like, sort of studying Judaism. I think it's a really interesting model. I would imagine it'd be really fruitful and just, like, a great opportunity for people working in synagogues whose daily routine probably has a lot of, even though you're doing holy work and sacred work, but there's a lot of like drudgery of, like, responding to 150 emails a day and just, you know, a lot of logistics of, like, you know, the nitty gritty and making sure that, you know, that there are babysitters for each Shabbat, and that the, you know, all the other Shabbat groups are staffed, and, you know, et cetera. It's whatever it may be in each of our, you know, sort of, you know, to-do lists each week. And then to get away and just think about ideas again must be really great.
Oh, it was absolutely wonderful. But more than that, meaning I do feel like there's a good amount, and I think this is, in some ways, I credit this to you and the, like, culture that of the staff that you've built here. Like, I do feel like I spend time every week learning Torah, whether it's daily Daf Yomi study. I also, like, Skype into a shiur every week, and I learn with a chavrusa who doesn't live here every week. And so, like, I do feel like I continue growing my own, but it's all very much, like, classic Torah sources. Like, it's a page of the Bavli, or it's Iyun in Masachet Ketubot, or it's continuing my, like, to grow my halachic knowledge through Chavrusa and Even Ezer. Like, it's not like, what did home rituals look like, or where was scholarship happening, and was it happening in the home in the 17th century in Prague, right? Like, that's not something that I would be like, wow. And like, that was really interesting to learn about, like, just to learn about Prague in that time period, what people's lives look like, what their domestic lives look like. We have descriptions of homes where, like, you would have 12 or 13 people, multi-generational families living in one Jewish home together in basically one room. Like, Prague was extremely high density. And there's even a description of, like, these, like, lofted beds that you couldn't, like, stand up in. You would just, like, climb up into and, like, roll away. So, like, first of all, like, privacy, not a thing. Like, and even things that we, like, when I teach college, I teach a lot about, like, how your sex life needs to be private. And like, the Gemara talks about it. And like, it should be in the dark and blah, 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 like, all this stuff, right? And then you're like, well, like, clearly they were procreating and they were all sleeping in one room together. Like, what? That's, like, a completely different, planet. And these people were learned, but, like, where was that happening? And, like, just like amazing things. We also learned about the person from Berkeley, the professor from Berkeley who spoke is an archaeologist, and she works at Tel Megiddo. In Tel Megiddo, it goes very early, so they have some like a lot of pre-Israelite stuff, including tombs that were like in homes, like in family homes under where these Canaanites lived.
Wow.
Tomb that's called Tomb 100 had like the remains of like upwards of 100 people. Then they just kept like shoving people in.
Wow.
And so it also helps you think about all of the responses that the Torah has in terms of like the corpse security.
Yeah.
Like you can't imagine a world in which a Jew would bury under the room that they live in.
Right.
Because also Tuma rises.
Yeah.
So it's just like, you learn something that's like seemingly like Canaanite ritual, whatever, and then you're like, oh my gosh, now I like understand the Torah so much better.
Yeah.
And the person, and then also like,
it's a great modern Orthodox synthesis, right?
I know. And then also like there's a person called a pakidu in each family whose job it was to maintain the kispu, which so they're memorable for their Hebrew cognates. Pakidu is like pakid.
Oh, okay.
Kispu is kishuf.
The kuf. All right.
With a kaf. And kishuv meaning like magic, like necromancy, and the pakidu, the pakid, the like one in charge would be like kind of the living patriarch of the family who had all these jobs vis-a-vis the dead in terms of like feeding them and whatever. But what that plus the Prague talk had me thinking about.
Sorry, you're correct. It's a kaf.
That's fine. It's totally fine. And what it had me thinking about was actually like multi-generational families, and how like in Prague you'd have like these multi-generational families all living together, and in ancient Canaan you would have these multi-generational families including dead ones all living together.
That's very
multi-generational. But like we still do, like people like, I want to be buried in my family plot.
Yeah, of course.
Like it's not in your home anymore, but it's still very much like the multi-generational, like the family lives on together. And then live on together. Or whatever, like the family
remains together.
Stays right, doesn't live on together, the opposite of lives on together. But it's kind of like this amazing thing of like we still value to a certain extent intergenerational living in death, but in life much less now. And actually like what does that mean then? And what that got me thinking about is something that I think about in terms of Arshel a lot, which is that synagogues are our intergenerational spaces. That it's not the Moishe house stuff that specifically is geared towards 20 and 30-year-olds, and it's not these schools which are geared towards children, and it's not old age homes either. It's the synagogue where actually all those people come together. And then what is it about like multi-generational spaces that we no longer keep inside of our domestic that is like really important to
maintain?
It's
a big challenge. I think we speak about this frequently actually in many contexts. It's a real challenge because most of us live in multi-generational homes. Our nuclear families are two generations, and that's pretty maybe you learned like when did you start living in nuclear families? I don't know, but okay. But we mostly do here in our community, and yet then the shul is really countercultural to like really every other part of our lives whether it's work or at home, where we don't have that many generations all kind of doing the same thing under the same roof at the same time.
And what it makes me think of, like, it's not like, oh, wow, the show is like the only intergenerational space in our lives. Like, that's not a new thought for me. But the new thought for me is that once upon a time, that was just like a natural order of being, and people didn't need to be taught how to engage in those spaces productively. Whereas I think now, actually, like, one of the things that we think about a lot is, like, how do we get people to even, like, sit down together or meet people who aren't in their, like, natural, like, we have children the same age, or we're both 25 and single, or whatever. And it's on us to like learn how to do that. It's not just like, oh, it's intuitive how to engage with people who are at different life stages from us.
And to see that as like a feature, not a bug of being part of a show, right? It's like, oh my goodness, all these old people, oh my goodness, all these young people and their different interests, and they're, and
they're crazy children.
Yeah, right. No, like that's actually like, that's the point. The point of a shul is that it has, like decades of life, experience, all under one roof, all at the same time, advocating for one another, needing one another, helping one another. Yeah.
all of that. But then someone made a really interesting point when I was talking about that, which was, does like the dislocation from your parents actually lead to more generative Jewish creativity? Meaning, let's say, just like as a silly example that it made me think of when he said that, my parents don't sing Isha Chayil. And Ethan and I sing Isha Chayil. My brother and my sister-in-law sing Isha Chayil and other stuff. And
all like, before dinner, wow.
All before dinner, yeah. And if we were all still living with my parents, like, would we do that? Definitely not, right?
Right, of course.
So it's kind of interesting in terms of like this dislocation. Like, it's not all bad of these like intergenerational dislocation. Like, it leads to like generative Jewish creativity.
I think married couples having their own bedrooms is a good thing too.
Also, totally, yes.
Running water, bathrooms, all great things.
Yeah, 100%. And like it's worth like thinking about the losses involved.
Absolutely.
Also, but really like in both directions. Like, I'd really been thinking about like, especially because like my grandmother lived with us when we were in high school, so like I come from this like intergenerational home and really believe in it. And yet it's sort of like, right, but my parents were living without my father's mother for many years and kind of made their own, like singing Eliyahu Navi before Havdalah, like that was not, that wasn't something that my grandparents did.
Right.
And came up with their own kind of home rituals before she moved back into what was very much their home.
Yeah.
So just kind of like all this, anyways, it's I'm so grateful that the shul gives me opportunities to engage in these professional development, things that exist in the world, which by the way, it's amazing that they even exist.
Yeah.
And that then we have the opportunity to go and participate in them, because it just kind of like sets your mind off in all of these different directions that hopefully ultimately end up in some way generative for the show. That
clearly it has been and will be. So I'm excited to, over the coming months, as these ideas percolate and as it stimulates your own scholarship and ideas. I'm looking forward to hearing what comes next.
Yeah, thank you. We are here in Shlunsky Studios with two illustrious Anshe Shalom alumni, or maybe I should say proud members of the Anshe Shalom diaspora. Tali, Arbit Winkler, and Jon Eskreis-Winkler. Welcome.
Thank you.
So where are you coming in from today?
We are currently in Chicago. We're here for Jon's dissertation defense.
I should have introduced you as Dr. Jon Eskreis-Winkler.
Successful dissertation defense. But we were just in Germany for 8 months, and now we're currently based in New York/New Jersey.
Awesome. Well, welcome back to Anshe Shalom in Chicago.
Thank you.
We arranged relatively decent weather for you also, which is really
better than New Jersey. We came from snow.
To tell you the truth, we miss using our good Chicago winter gear. The East Coast really doesn't do it for us.
And we miss having you guys here, obviously, but we also miss having you guys in Germany, because our German listenership to the podcast has plummeted.
We have been loyal listeners since the beginning.
One of the neat things about the software that we use to broadcast the podcast, it tells us where, by state or country, where each download of the podcast occurs. So it's always fun to see the different states where people are listening or have listened, and the different countries. So we used to have a regular, reliable 2 downloads every episode from Germany, and that seems to have petered off.
But if you're the guy who listens in Spain, can you get in touch with us? Because we're so curious about you.
Yes. Also the Oklahoma people. But,
also the Oklahoma people.
Wow, word is spreading.
I know. Straw hats everywhere.
So Jon, tell us about your dissertation. Is there any possibility that I would understand the topic or even the title?
Definitely. I'd love to share a little bit. The title of my dissertation is Multi-Resolution Analysis in Discrete Spaces. And this is a way of putting a fancy title on dissertation so people will call you a doctor. Really, all I'm doing is working in networks and trying to find structure that exists in things like social networks, identifying community. One would think that maybe ideas of community detection that I am working on might be of interest to the Jewish community, trying to target subgroups of interest.
So how do you identify a community?
There's a lot of different ways, and it depends on the size of the network, probably which strategy you would take. But what can I say? Some things are like sort of simple. In English, you could understand through like it's called like diffusion processes. So like if you understand like we're starting with you, Tali, as the first person in the community, we could see who you're friends with, like see how information or mass, whatever word you want to use, like spreading out through the network from Tali, that would slowly give you a sense of who the people she's connected to are, like what comprises the like sort of group that has this high level of interconnectedness.
So let's say you had approximately 350 units of people, and they all paid dues to this one organization. Yeah. Does that make them a community?
That seems like a question you should answer.
Okay, very good. So, Tali, tell us what you were up to in Germany.
So I was doing research towards my dissertation. I'm looking at the history of Hebrew and Yiddish books in the 16th to 18th centuries. So I spent a lot of time looking at archival documents in German, which, fun fact, uses a different alphabet. So it's much harder to read than you would think.
The old German.
Yeah, different script. It's a different. It's like reading Rashi script. If you never learned Rashi script, it's just different letters, and you have to learn how to read the letters.
For years, I thought that my PhD in statistics was more challenging than Tali's PhD in history, because anyone can read a history book. What's the big deal? After we started doing research, I've discovered that Tali's work is much harder than mine, and I never want to do it.
I'm glad you've divided that appropriately. Can you tell us, I don't know, how was life in Germany? What did you really appreciate there?
Did you miss us?
Yes.
We definitely missed you. That's why we listen to every podcast episode. So, I mean, there is a Jewish... We were in Frankfurt, so there is a Jewish community there. It's interesting to see what's going on there.
I think going there, we were you had been there earlier. I was expecting like very little Jewish support there. It turns out there's a daily minyan in Frankfurt. We live very close by to it. People are very reliable. They never missed a morning minyan.
Wow. You should bring them here.
There was a daf yomi of one there, but the minyan consisted of 10 men. Yeah.
So there's a lot of Russian Jews in Germany in general, slightly less so in Frankfurt because it's more of a commercial center, but there were still a lot of Russian Jews who made up part of the community. And just the structure is very different because there isn't this same sense of like volunteering to help the community. The way it works is that everyone identifies the religious community that they want to be a part of, and the government will then withhold a certain percentage of your income tax and give that to the community.
The Gemeinde.
Gemeinde. So you're not voluntarily paying dues, you're like having money taken out of your taxes, and then the sense is, I've paid my taxes, now you owe me services. So people don't volunteer to lane or to lead davening. They hire a full-time chazan. They have 2 full-time rabbis. They hire a full-time mikveh lady. Anything that happens, you get paid for because they don't have the same sense of like volunteering for the community, and there aren't necessarily as many people who are qualified to do those things anyway.
So where are you living now, and what's next for you guys?
So we are currently living with my parents in New Jersey while we're looking for an apartment.
Thank you, David and Shira.
But Jon will be working at ASBI as a data scientist. And I will still be working on my dissertation, which I can do from anywhere.
Do your parents have plants?
They actually have been babysitting a couple of our plants for us while we were in Germany, which I am hoping to take back once we have our own place.
So where are you looking for an apartment? How's your search going? What are you looking for?
It's really hard to find a substitute for Lakeview in the New York area. We'll say that. We have been looking really hard. So I think we're probably going to end up in Brooklyn. ASBI is in Brooklyn, and it seems like there's a cool community there.
We look forward to hearing about that, and hope we wish you a lot of luck on that. And just want to say that it's very, I think, important to those of us here that our alumni feel connected to the shul. I think that's really important to we're trying to create something different here. We're trying to do something special here, and that people who pass through our shul and move on to wonderful other communities, we hopefully take a little bit of the spirit of Anshe Shalom with them and continue to feel connected to the shul and come back and visit and keep us informed of news in your lives. And so thank you for doing that, and to anyone else listening in our alumni community, you're really important to us. We think about you, and we hope you just continue to feel connected to the shul.
And come back anytime.
Yeah, we're really happy to be back.
Yeah, Lakeview was really special for us. We really enjoyed our time here, and we're very happy to be back, at least for a little bit.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Straw Hat. We really hope you enjoyed. As always, thank you so much to our producer, Haley Leventhal. If you loved this episode and you want to tell us about it by voice note or in person or by email or by phone, we would love to hear from you. If you did not enjoy this episode and you want to tell us about that, you should definitely dig a hole under your bedroom and bury it there, and then rebuild your bedroom on top of it. That seems like a really appropriate place for a lot of your complaints about the podcast. Have a wonderful day and week.